You're listening to Talk Daredevil, the official podcast of the Save Daredevil campaign.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Talk Daredevil. And my name is Christine, and I'm joined by
Lauren
and Shelby. Hey, guys.
Hi. Today we are talking about sort of the science of Daredevil, which is something that I, in previous podcasts that I've been on, have sort of hinted at us maybe trying out. I was thinking that maybe I should also, mention my own sort of credentials for speaking on this topic at all, since I don't work in the sciences anymore. My own background is I have a master's in biotech engineering. And I did at one point work a lot in genetics and biochemistry. And also as part of my training, we did a lot of physics and chemistry and stuff. And I've always, since I was a kid, been super interested in the sciences in general. So that's kind of my academic background sort of into this. And I've always also been particularly interested in neurology and sort of the compensations that happen when you lose a sense, for instance, and stuff. So that's always, so I had that with me when I started reading Daredevil and when I saw the movie and I started reading it. So that's one of the reasons that I, because I loved superheroes growing up, and I also have this interest, which is one of the reasons that Daredevil is like super, extra interesting to me, and why I care about this so much, because I see this such a great opportunity for Daredevil to be like even better, even more interesting, and also sort of be more both a legitimate superhero and also more sort of genuinely blind. People who know me sort of in the bigger Daredevil fan sphere, and who might know my ignored blog, the other Murdoch Papers, this has always been like sort of one of my absolute favorite topics to discuss and nitpick about, and also just nerd out about. So maybe we should first just, talk about why this should matter to people who are not us. Why this topic, and if Daredevil is a superhero, why does this stuff even matter? I have my own thoughts, but I'd like to hear yours too.
I think why this topic. Number one, I'm Christine's number one fan, so that's why.
I don't know. I feel like I've read all of her blog posts, so.
Okay, we'll fight it out. Also,
I think pop quiz later.
Yeah, right. Just reading the comics though is where I sort of come at this from. Is just especially some of the older issues, and just wondering what's he going to be able to do in this one, and I just want to get your take on it. What's kind of real? What's maybe not real? Impossible, possible. So.
Yeah.
For me, his senses are, probably my favorite part about reading about him. I mean, one of the favorite parts. It's what I love. There are a lot of superheroes with so many fantastic things they can do. And one of the things I love about Matt and Daredevil is he's not really superhuman. Like, he has super senses. And as much as I love what he can do, I really love watching
what he can't do.
What he can't do, and what are those limitations? Because he's a superhero with a disability as well. I like to kind of see that play together, I guess. I love that he can do some really cool things, but I don't want him to be able to just do anything and all things, and so powerful that he has no limitations. And I think for me, what makes a great superhero, it's not necessarily about what they can do, but it's about their weaknesses.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I think that's also, for me, one of the reasons that there's a point to actually kind of discussing what he can and can't do, and what the limitations would be, because he's one of those few characters that in becoming too powerful, he sort of risks becoming less interesting in a way. And at the same time, he's got this sort of There's a sort of a problem built into the character that I find kind of interesting, and that problem is that he's built on this sort of assumption of sensory compensation, and which means that there's even, it's often stated outright that to compensate for his lack of sight, he developed all these super senses, and that I think has led a lot of writers to either kind of just like ignore situations where this isn't true, because there's a lot of situations where this really isn't true, um, and it's kind of like if we could just allow for the fact that in some ways he's super compensating, like in the sense that he can do things that no other person, blind or sighted, could do. But on the other hand, there are things that he legitimately cannot do despite his senses. It makes him more interesting as a character. But I also think that because this character is so obviously based on very, very old, centuries old notions of blindness in a way. It's been a common theme throughout, literary history on all continents, pretty much. That there's been this idea that the blind can do incredible things and have senses that go beyond our own, and so on. And I've looked at a lot of these examples, and a lot of them are very like you'd think that with Daredevil, like, oh, he got, it's radiation, he's a superhero, all this stuff happened, and then that there are examples from sort of literary history where you have characters who have almost sort of Daredevil superpowers, but they're not, supposed to actually. This is supposed to be just a consequence of blindness, and so I mean, it's very obvious that Daredevil's kind of built on that trope. So there's like a historical connection to sort of a vast amount of literature there, but there's also, of course, where it kind of rubs up against our own reality, in the sense that. Even though the kind of sort of ridiculous levels of compensation that we see in the comics are not real, there's still sort of the idea that, yes, it is possible for, some blind people to be extremely good at detecting the presence of silent objects, for instance, and things that would appear to be sort of supernatural, but are not. But then, of course, so Daredevil has all of that, but it's like it's turned up, to the nth degree and everything. And then I also enjoy the fact that he, because of this sort of grounded background, it is it's not completely futile to try to pick apart what he can and can't do and kind of bring that into our reality, and have sort of break it down and look at it more closely, in a way that would be kind of meaningless for characters that are super powerful, or as we've all, maybe, or most of us, have seen WandaVision, and we're not going to have no spoilers for WandaVision here, but
Yeah.
in that case, we were talking about characters who really have like sort of magical abilities that are just so far out there, that like there's no point trying to explain that in any kind of grounded, sense of science. I mean, that's magic.
Yeah.
And the rules are very, very different, if there are rules at all. So, and Daredevil isn't like that. It's like there's actually a point to talking about this, because it's also through using Daredevil as kind of a lens, we can also learn more about science, about how our own senses work and don't work, at least if you kind of scratch the surface and look underneath. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I love it at the heart of it. Even if he's trying to defuse a bomb, you're like, okay, well, he can hear this, he can hear that. At the heart of it, he cannot tell the difference between a red wire and a blue wire.
Exactly.
Like,
Right?
yeah. Yeah, and of course, I think that the writers should lean into that a little bit more, also. But generally, when it comes to like, okay, so what is close to reality and what is just super, not ever going to happen. I think one distinction that I like to make personally, when I've written about this in the past, is sort of like the distinction between kind of biology and physics, in the sense that neither one of us can hear sounds at like 35 or 40,000 hertz. The human sort of range ends at 20,000, and that's if you're like super young. By our age, like, and we're not even super old, it's going to be down to like 16 or 17,000 hertz. So it's not possible for a human to hear 35,000 hertz, but I've got a cat lying next to me who can hear 35,000 hertz. So obviously it's not physically impossible to hear that. My cat can hear it. There's a sound, it's out there, but it's not it's not biologically possible for me as a human, but it's not physically impossible generally. So that would be an example of something that's sort of like, okay, that's in the realm of like a super sense that oh yeah, maybe you can hear 35,000 hertz, and there could be a way for you to do that. But where it becomes physically impossible, and this is also the case in one thing that pops up in a lot of Daredevil comics and in the show too, is when Matt is hearing things from like extreme distances. That kind of stuff tends to actually break the laws of physics, because it's not simply a matter of what his ears can do. It's also the matter of the physics of sound. How far does sound travel before it becomes not sound, or it bounces off of something, or you have a very like thick wall or something that reduces the energy of that sound down to, nothing in some cases. So you have sort of that physical reality where a lot of cases, and I mean, this would be true for Superman too. I mean, he can, you use super hearing to explain that, but super hearing can't actually explain that, because it's not just about the hearing, it's about the stimulus too, like the sound coming in. So that's where I tend to nitpick a lot. But then on the other hand, it's like you have to kind of, make allowances for the fact that it's, a comic book hero. So I do make allowances for that. Otherwise, we could just shut this down right away. But having said that, I do think that one of Daredevil's more sort of like plausible abilities is really the fact that he can walk around and sense objects. It's like that is not the most far-fetched of his abilities. Quite the contrary. I think that actually is more like, if you did have super hearing, and if you tweak a lot of stuff, that's not something that's beyond reason, since echolocation is a real phenomenon and everything. But we could possibly get back to that. But anyway, that's kind of how I approach it. But anyway, but we thought we'd look at some examples from the show and some stuff that I want to talk about and you guys want to talk about, and we can just kind of hash it out. So Shelby, you want to go first, maybe?
Yeah, so I don't know about you guys, but I was super excited when the show came out just to see how they would handle these super senses. Would it be like in the comics where he's reading print with his fingertips like every day, or would it be more grounded? And I think the first thing we want to talk about is how he does explain his senses. And, he goes on to explain his senses to Claire, Foggy, and Karen at different points in the show, but maybe we want to start with the fiery elephant in the room.
The world on fire.
A good place to start.
The world on fire. I know you probably have thoughts on. I get what they were trying to do, but with the abstract, like impressionistic visual.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. I wasn't too happy with it. Well, there are a couple of things that I did appreciate about it, and first and foremost, what they're showing him when they're doing that scene that is sort of painted, quote unquote, in the world on fire effect, and he's looking, quote unquote, looking at Claire. It's not like it's super detailed. Did appreciate that. That it's not like a lot of times, and especially this is hard in the comics, because like the comics, comic books are such a visual medium, and how are you gonna relay the appearance of something visually that's not visual? It's like super hard. So I mean, it's a really tough nut to crack. And a lot of times it's treated like, I'd call it the Instagram filter fallacy. I think I just made that up. Trademark.
I like it.
Awesome. That is awesome.
No, but it's sort of like, instead, I think when, creators they kind of jump to the assumption that Matt's world is like our world, but like, and it's like a filter stuck in, or like a filter that's put in front of him.
Yeah.
But it's more like, no, you have to start with a freaking dark room. Imagine it from that, and then add on impressions and like an object and And I think with the world on fire, it was like, it was nice it wasn't detailed, but I think pretty much everything else about it fails for me, because it's not at all obvious to viewers what it is that's giving him whatever it is he's quote unquote seeing. And a lot of it seems to be that it's that he's heat sensing to a great degree. And this is something that comes up in the show in a few different times, and we'll talk about that later. And this has also now kind of made its way into the comic after the show. But that's not actually a way to perceive humans or really anything else. So the whole fiery thing, what is that supposed to be? Is that supposed to be, I mean, it's not sound exactly. even though in other times in the show they
Yeah, I
make
don't
it
know. Were
pretty
they trying to
clear.
go red? Was that their thing? Like red? I don't know.
Yeah, and it's almost like they want to tie it into like the devil inside, like it's something that it's almost like it's his senses mixed up with his worldview or something, where it's like it looks like a world on fire, not only because this is what I'm seeing, but I have this fire inside, and the world is it's like a battlefield and it's a war zone, and it's really, I think it's confused so many people, and I think that's also why they didn't use it beyond that point, because it's like it didn't really work.
Well, too,
And
because
I'm
she
not,
says like, "What do you actually see?" And I think
yeah,
that's the line that confuses people. And then world on fire, and then he sees her face, and it's
yeah.
I had issues with it too. You kind of come away with that going, "Oh, so he can see." It's like, no,
Yeah.
no, not at all.
Yeah.
And thinking back to the comics, there have been creators who have said, I think Chip has said this, like, it's so great writing for Daredevil because there's not this giant stack of notes from Marvel of what you can and can't do. And I'm over here like, can we just have like a post-it note of like what you can and can't do?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like over time it would have been nice if they had sat down and tried to figure out what he actually can and can't do.
Yeah.
And you even see from artist to artist, different renderings of that, some good, some bad. I really enjoyed Samney's his take on it, very simple with the lines. You can't really see you can't see faces. You cannot see Claire's eyeball that way, or her iris.
This was kind of a joke about the Daredevil movie as well. I think we talked about that on that episode where it's like her pupils are showing in the rain. It's like, no.
And I think a big part of that, the problem is that they wanted this to be a really romantic scene, and they're like, if we don't give her pupils, like, she's gonna look creepy. And it's like, well,
he can't see her at all.
Well, I mean, he can't see that much, and it's interesting. Having been reading some comics and also going to fanfic, but it's interesting because I feel like you have a lot of these creators who they're very focused on, this is a superhero. Okay, he has these senses or these disabilities, whatever, but look at all this great stuff he can do. And you kind of go to the fans and, and maybe it's a gender thing, maybe it's the girls are writing it more so than men. I have not read Nascenti's run, so I can't speak to that. But they're much more like, there's a man and he's broken and he has a disability, but he also has these amazing senses. Oh, he happens to be a superhero. I feel like the focus is very different. And so I feel like a lot of times fans are very focused on like the senses and what he can and can't do. And a lot of times in the comics or, in the show, they don't really think that that's important. I don't know, the people are working on it like as important as these, grand things that he's saving people from. And I'm like, but it really, for me, it comes down to like what he can and can't do. Like that's important to me.
Yeah, no, and it's like a strength that this character has. That's like something that makes him like super interesting, and that they could be leaning into more and not lose a single reader. I'm sure they would actually gain readers and viewers as far as the show and live action is concerned. Because I really do think that like they could lean into it more and explore more and be more down to earth, and it would not like ruin the character at all. Quite the contrary. So, but I think it's also like I mentioned at the beginning, where it's sort of like it's been kind of built into the character that his senses are supposed to compensate. So there's been sort of this kind of like bias in the narrative for all of these decades of comics where, because the writer and the artist, they are the gods of the story in a sense. They decide which situations this character is put into. And he's very, very rarely put into situations that are difficult for him unless he needs to be for some very, obvious and some reason of the story. And then a lot of times in those cases too, they actually go to great lengths to actually make up some really kind of absurd way for him to be in trouble instead of like, yep, but you have this part right here, where the part where he can't see stuff. That's also something you could use from time to time. And that's also been a thing in literary history where like there are very, very few characters who are blind in history who are not they all tend to be like totally blind. So we're very used to thinking about blindness and sightedness as this sort of dichotomy where there are very few people in the middle. And it's like you either have 20/20 vision or you're like totally blind. Whereas, in real life, it is actually quite common, much, much more common for people to have, partial sight or have like a severe impairment, but they can do some things and not others and stuff. So in that sense, Matt Murdock is sort of more of a typical person with vision impairment than sort of the imagined Matt Murdock without super senses would be. Sort of like, yes, of course, there are totally blind people out there, and a lot of them do amazingly well, and live very normal and happy and productive lives and everything. But it's also true that most people with a vision impairment do have some vision. So it's not as if the fact that he can sense some things and not others, that sort of makes him like not blind or something. That's not the case at all. I think a lot of people kind of jump to that conclusion. And it actually reminds me of like the scene when Matt is explaining his senses to Foggy, and Foggy is in his apartment, and he asks, how many fingers am I holding up? And then he shows him the middle finger. So, classic scene. A lot of people, I think, are looking at that and going like, oh my gosh, he could see that it was the one finger. And I'm like, do you realize that counting fingers is like the test you do when you run out of like the eye chart, when you can no longer see any letter on the eye chart? The next thing they go to is counting fingers. That means like you are very, very nearly blind when you can only quote unquote count fingers. So it's not as if that's like, oh, yeah, that's 20/20 vision right there. It's like, no, it's really not. Like even someone with very reduced visual acuity can usually count fingers and see, hand motions and stuff like that. But where we draw the line, of course, is a different story. But I think it's important to keep in mind that we don't have to come at this as a kind of an either or kind of thing. Before I go too long on this, how about we sort of jump to the next scene, which was one of mine that I'm going to pick apart and complain about. Talking about this stuff makes me so happy, but it also makes me go on little rants sometimes. So, like, bear with me.
We'll reel you back in if we need to.
Yeah. But one scene I wanted to mention is when young Matt and Stick, when they are, this is in season 1, episode 7, Stick, when they are in the park together and they're eating ice cream. And first of all, they're eating ice cream where Stick can tell exactly how many different freaking dairies that ice cream came from. To which I say,
God, what a way to make ice cream suck. I mean, that just
I know. But not only that, but like you would have actually had to visit every single one of those dairies he's talking about and sampling their milk and being like really good at it in order to do that, because that's one thing that's sort of like when we always assume that like sort of Daredevil or Stick in this case would have like an encyclopedic
I think Stick was just trying to ruin ice cream.
Yeah,
maybe
I think so.
He's just flexing here and just being like, look how cool I am, and really he's just bullshitting.
Yeah. So, but then there's also like the other part, and this is why I mentioned earlier that there's like a lot of heat sensing in the show that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Is that there's like this couple walking by, and Matt is supposed to be able to detect. Is one thing that her heartbeat is raising. That's fine. But he can tell that like she's blushing and stuff. And you really can't. This also happens in another later episode when Matt faces Nobu. And then afterwards he's talking about, I should have sensed him. I should have sensed his body heat. No, you shouldn't have. Like he was like in a different room. And I think that the reason people don't think twice about that is that we're used to thinking about like heat vision goggles. Like you are like there are ways to visualize infrared light. And infrared light, of course, is kind of like something that co-occurs with heat. I mean, all objects with a temperature above absolute zero, which in reality is all objects, emit infrared light. And because we can visualize that from a distance, we maybe tend to think that you could also, like, if you have super senses, you could, like, heat sense someone from a distance. But the thing is that the skin, that's not how we detect heat with our skin. They're not photoreceptors like in the retina that detects the infrared light as photons, where we would be sort of like, the skin would be like a large retina with like photoreceptors on it, and you would detect the infrared. That's not how it works. What you detect is like the temperature of the skin at your skin. That's what you detect. There are one class of snakes in nature and one species of bat that has something that is even remotely similar to what they're suggesting that Matt can do, which is that they have like these little heat pits where they can detect like prey with like heat from some not a very great distance. But this is extremely rare even in nature. And more importantly, it's not how thermoreception in mammals generally or in the skin works. That, I mean, if he can detect infrared light that way with his skin, then he might as well be able to see with his skin because it would be the same thing. So it's not like, I mean, if we have a person standing like a few feet away from us, that's not going to drive up the temperature of the air that's right next to your skin. That's going to be at, sort of at the ambient temperature. You're going to notice, like, if you sit next close to a fire, that's an impressive amount of heat that's like right next to you, and that's going to temporarily create sort of a hotter than the average kind of experience where it heats your skin like right there. But that's what you would have to do it. But it's not, you can't imagine that the skin is like a retina, which is, so I guess that's what I'm going with that. But that's something that's now made it into the comics, and I'm like, this really does not work that way at all.
Yeah, the same thing on objects too, because I just read an issue where he could like pick up the heat signature on a pen that like Bullseye had just thrown or something. So I was like,
Yeah, that used to happen a lot in the old comics where he would like, it's one thing if he's like touching something and can tell that, okay, this object is hotter than the desk it's on. I mean, sure, but how long do you imagine a heat? It's like that dissipates really fast. Like that's what nature wants to do. It wants to go to, like level. It wants to hit an average, that's kind of how nature tends to work. Like you don't want temperature gradients, that's so you need an impressive amount of heat for there to be like, like from a fryer you're sitting next door. If you're sitting very close to another person, then that person is hot enough right next to you to be able to create like sort of a heat gradient that actually warms the air that's right next to your arm that you can feel.
You probably should be worried they might have a fever.
It's one of those things where it's like, you would need more than like just a superpower. You would need a completely different kind of power that humans do not have at all and that barely exists in other animals. So it's just kind of, but I do think it's something, the idea probably comes from heat sensing with like night vision goggles. I'm pretty sure that's where it comes from.
Yeah,
but to everyone writing Daredevil, it doesn't work.
I was going to say like watching Ghost Adventures where you see him with the infrared camera.
Yeah.
I think that's...
But that's still, you're using vision to see that. You're seeing the photons as photons. Yeah, so that's why that doesn't work.
No, it's great.
No. This is great.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm still learning things.
Yeah, no, but speaking of stuff that even like I just thought of, is like the part where he like can hear heartbeats, which is also not like, I mean, it's kind of crazy, but it's also most of the biggest reason we can't hear heartbeats is because most of the sort of sound output of the heart is too low for us, like too low in frequency for us to hear. So it's most of the energy is at like these ultra low frequencies that the human ear can't hear. But if we were to be able to hear that low, like say at like 10 to 50 hertz, and hear much better, we might be able to hear heartbeat. That's one of those things where it's like it's biologically impossible, but probably not physically impossible. But anyway, one thing that they never mention, and something that is way louder than a human heart, is like all the other stuff going on in your body, like your bowels move. Like you can even hear when someone's hungry. Can you imagine hearing that like all the time? You can like hear people's like
that'd be so
their
gross.
Intestines moving around, and
I really
and
just
people
have
like smacking, and
it would be
so
the
that
worst.
would be way
It
more
would be
audible.
so
that
gross.
would be so that would be a great reason that nobody could hide from him. Like if he can hear their intestines kind of casually moving around in their stomachs, that's probably a better way to detect someone than heartbeats. But it's not, it doesn't sound as cool. So
yeah, it's kind of gross, and it would be like feel bad for Daredevil.
Yeah.
But maybe this is jumping ahead, but talking about things like heartbeats and even like what's going on inside your body, how do you feel about the idea that he has to put his focus to certain things, like walking into the room and missing Elektra because his focus is somewhere else and things like that?
Yeah. No, I do think focus is one of those things that, remember in the past when I've sort of been involved in the fandom and you hear people discuss different things. I remember there was a scene, I don't remember which one it was, from Brubaker and Michael Lark's run, where some fan was kind of upset that Matt hadn't just detected some surveillance across the street or something. And I really think that people need to remember that even for him, attention is a limited resource. It is a very limited resource. And our minds are constantly working to just sort of, you have a kind of an attentional spotlight that you direct to certain things that you're looking at right then and there. And we may have this illusion that we're, constantly focused on everything, but we're really not. And I think it would be a very sort of human thing for the same thing to apply to Daredevil. That Matt, even though he's got this heightened senses, he's still got the same human weaknesses of like, oh, I simply didn't pay attention. I was focused on something else. I mean, people can miss kind of obvious things because their mind is just elsewhere. And I think especially when his senses are taking in so much information, especially if something is not super obvious, like the thing with Elektra, because, maybe detecting sort of whatever it takes to detect her is actually something that's, if he's not expecting to meet someone in his apartment that he lives in by himself, that makes it hard for him to just notice right away when he was thinking about his date with Karen and everything, and his mind was just elsewhere. And I think that for people to be kind of, semi upset that Matt can't like detect everything simultaneously, like nobody can, So that's
I actually
kind of
like
my
that.
thought about that.
I love it too. I like when he misses things.
Yeah.
And I think we've actually talked about this before, Christine, his use of the cane.
Yeah.
No, he doesn't need it. But talking about like his focus, and depending on what he's doing, it would be useful to use a cane, especially in a place like New York City. So he doesn't have to be putting focus on that necessarily. Like it kind of gives him a little more brain space to focus on other things.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it, actually, and I've thought about that too, and I think about it kind of in similar ways. Yeah, it's something that would help you sort of not have to direct your attention to that as much, and I'm thinking, especially since he's using his ears to do. I mean, there's like, of course, a radar in the comic that sometimes, or most of the time, imagine has a separate sense, but sometimes not. But that's a separate issue. But in the show, we know that his hearing kind of has to do two things. It has to both function as his hearing and as his quote unquote, pseudo vision.
Yeah.
So of course, if he's walking down the street and if he's maybe even having a conversation with someone, or even like if he, want to talk on the phone or even concentrate on something, maybe he's like, doing surveillance and there's like a super interesting conversation behind him that he needs to pay attention to, then yeah, I would absolutely think that the cane would sort of be like free up some space for him to direct his attention elsewhere, especially since his hearing is sort of, having to do double duty. But I think there's another important reason for why he would use a cane and not have to feel bad about it. And that reason is that there are people who don't technically need a cane for mobility reasons to still use one. They tend to be a little bit shorter and they maybe can be used for some things, but for people who are, who may not technically need it, can still use it. And one important thing is to inform other people that
definitely.
You have severely reduced vision. It would be kind of a way for people to understand what his needs are in terms of like giving him information about things. And I mean, it's got that scene in season 3 when he's looking for the dry cleaner.
Yes.
Where in that entire episode,
that was
I
great.
actually pointed that out at the time. Like he's kind of, Matt Murdock is dead, according to him. Like Matt Murdock doesn't exist, but he still walks around with his cane that he doesn't need for mobility. But in order for him to find the information that he needs in that guise, not as Daredevil, but as himself, he needs to kind of lean into the blind guy bit, and the way he can get information that makes sense to him is to communicate to people that he's blind.
Yeah.
And that's the way he can get the information that's suitable for him to receive, not a reference to something visual that would then
Definitely.
Generate further questions. So I think there are several reasons why he shouldn't feel bad about it, or feel like, I mean, yeah, it's a lot of pretense, of course, to be him, but that's not like the worst part of it for me at all. So
yeah, definitely. And I remember in the when he's explaining to Karen in season 3, she's like, the cane is just an act.
Yeah.
He's like, yeah. It's like, okay, I understand for the purpose of this. Like, that makes sense. But I'm over here like, we could really dive into this. Like,
it's actually also too when she says, "Can you see me?" and he was like, "No, not exactly," or something like that. And I'm like, just end it with no. I can't no.
There's a lot of hedging around this. Yeah, and I think it's because a lot of the creators aren't feeling 100% sure about what they are asserting, in a sense, when it comes to Daredevil. So I am here to help for a very, very reasonable fee, as in like $0. I would do this for.
I know. Oh my God.
So I mean, so there's a lot of ways to kind of look at it. And that's, I think there's even a scene from the comics. I'm trying to remember who the writer was. Chichester, I think. Back in the 80s, it was after Matt got back with Karen after Born Again, and he's walking down the street, and he is actually saying to himself that I'm letting my inner blind guy sort of lead me as I lose myself in her scent or whatever it was, where he's sort of indicating that he's putting himself on kind of like autopilot, like he's just like the cane is kind of autopilot, and he's like his concentration is completely elsewhere. So, which suggests that, I mean, there could be that sort of use for it. And then, of course, you have like all the times when like it snows outside and like the echoes are not as good, or there's another issue from the comics where he's got a head cold that's really bad, and that like muffles everything for him. So so there are situations like that, of course. I feel like we could just spend like a whole episode on like each one of these.
We could just go. We could just like just keep talking forever, because now I guess we need to get in. Well, I just want to know like kind of what you think is, in the show they really like make the hearing be the most important thing. They've even taken it away from him twice.
Yeah.
What do you think is the most important super sense?
Well, hearing, absolutely, especially for Daredevil, since it's such a prominent sense. It's both like his super hearing and his pseudo vision, as I would call it. So definitely that. And I think even though we're sometimes led to believe that, like in the comics, it's either when you read sort of like the first issue or the first page of an issue, and it's got sort of like, the description of his senses, like as a young child, Matt Murdock lost his sight and he was compensated, blah blah blah. For a while, I think especially during the Bendis run, it said that his radar was a combination of his senses, which is sort of like, okay, but what do you mean by radar? If you mean like general, just sort of like everything you can sense, like the totality of your sensations and perceptions, then yeah, of course, all of the senses come into that. But in terms of what other sense besides vision can give you a spatial sense of the world, hearing is like the best candidate, by far compared to all the other senses. However, I have also often said that I think that his sense of smell is very underplayed and underused and just kind of undervalued. And I think a lot of that has to do with where sense ranks for humans, in general. Like, we're a very visual species, and we also like to talk a lot. So we like to focus on those two senses, like our eyes and ears. And we tend to kind of associate like, smell as something like we kind of watch our dogs do, and they sort of sniff something on the ground and go like, oh, I wonder if that's interesting. But we don't really have a very strong, like we do have a strong relationship to it, but it's not something we verbalize and think about a lot. I think even at the time of COVID, I think smell has maybe, kind of come up a bit, since a lot of people have had issues with losing their sense of smell. And I've read a lot of interesting stories about this, where people have gone, many months and not having it back, and what a loss that is to them. And I think I even heard someone mention that apparently depression after losing your sense of smell is actually more common than after losing your sight or something, because it's something that's, which sounds bizarre, but at the same time, it's so unexpected. And certainly people like, you can't smell your loved ones, and you can't, and your food doesn't taste like anything. So a lot of the things we get enjoyment from, like, food, for instance, that's mostly smell, but we tend to not appreciate smell. So I think that smell is not used as much as it could be. But there is actually, it gets us back on topic, there's a really good scene that I know that several of us wanted to talk about from season 2, where Matt is tracking the Punisher by scent, where I remember watching that and thinking, wow, finally they're exploring, they're actually using his sense of smell for something. That's
I wonder with the lack of using smell is just really like, it's just not sexy. It's not cool. Like, I don't know why they don't really use scent as much. I mean, on top of everything you said. But yeah, I love that scene where he's tracking the Punisher. Like, yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
I mean, one reason could be that it's and it's been suggested in one paper I've read that suggests that a lot of times when scent is used for blind characters in fiction, it tends to almost kind of evoke an animalistic kind of vibe where it's something that we associate with lower animals. And this was something that even, Sigmund Freud talked about, sort of scent as something that we kind of grow out of as adults. Of course, there's also been suggestion that maybe that was something that was specific to Sigmund Freud, who, besides having like chronic sinus issues, also had, I think he used cocaine. And there's like a whole story about how Sigmund Freud personally probably did gradually lose his sense of smell as he got older, and then he kind of applied that to like humanity generally. So it's like,
wow.
I don't remember if it was cocaine. I'll have to like double check this. We can put it in the show notes. but I mean, he was,
that must be some bad cocaine. Bless him.
Yeah. So I think that some of it could be like it's maybe not dignified enough. It's something like, oh, smelling is something your dog does. It's not something that you do. And then we also think that maybe that's oh, poor thing, he has to smell things or something. So I think, again, people are like a bit afraid of like leaning into what it is he has and what he does and stuff. So,
well, it is probably like the least like conspicuous thing. He's going out in this hoodie. We know he can't hear, like half hear.
Yeah.
He can't walk around like touching things. So he can walk around and like sniff things.
Yeah.
I think smell definitely for like different adults. Like I'm not a smeller. Like I'm very averse to like bad smells. So I actually like, if I even like think that there's going to be bad smell, I like stop smelling. My husband's the exact opposite. He literally smells everything. And so does my daughter.
Yeah, I'm with your husband.
Everything. Yeah. He'll like go, ooh, this is gross. Smell it. And I'm like, why did you smell that? You knew it was going to be gross. And so it's interesting. Like, I feel like just different people have different relationships to smell. Because I feel like I wouldn't use that as much.
I think it's like Christine says, like a smell can take you back, though. Like it's like true, a memory,
Yeah. So going back to your thoughts on how, smell tends to be looked at maybe even subconsciously, like a little animalistic. I don't think we've talked about this. I know we have like maybe privately, but I think writers in the show and in comics have maybe shied away from really like digging in and like really exploring his senses and how it relates to like his disability. Is really, if they don't have like access to, the blind and visually impaired community, then maybe they're just it's a little nerve-wracking because you want to treat this disability with respect in this community while putting forth this character that can do things that they can't, and balancing that can be like really stressful, I think.
Yeah.
And even if you have certain people that are totally okay with what you're doing, you're never going to please everybody. So I think sometimes they err to a safe side of things, just out of precaution.
Yeah.
I've been a part, like I have some friends in the blind community. My husband worked for Association for the Blind. So being around, people who have different visual impairments and just talking about that, like, it was definitely been interesting. I was a fan of Daredevil before meeting a lot of these people, but kind of I always really liked when the writers focused on Matt as a person and like and his disability and like what he can't do, and really grounding him as an actual person who is blind, even though he can do all these senses. So I don't really envy the writers and having to walk this line, but I do think it's an interesting maybe enter into that world and get to know people.
Okay, I think we're actually kind of almost coming up on time, but we had so many other things we wanted to cover that we're thinking of maybe like doing like a lightning round where we quickly cover some other scenes that we wanted to talk about. So in a minute or less per scene, let's first talk the touch reading, the blueprints in season 1. This is going to be a challenge. Like in the comics, as you know, Matt can read print by touch. It's possible that this was also going to be in the show because there's actually talk of like a cut scene where Matt reads a headline of a paper, which is not, I guess, as hard as like reading the fine print. That was tossed, and he's never like read print in the show aside from that. But the touch reading the blueprints, a lot of people brought that up. But in my mind, this is actually a scene where he is just recognizing them as blueprints. And I think what lends further credence to that is the fact that he's not touching them for very long. If he really wanted to explore it, he would actually have to touch it all over and like, ooh, what's this? But he just he touches them. It's like, oh, these are blueprints, I guess, and then moves on, which I think is actually quite reasonable because I think blueprints should probably have a particular.
Yeah, I feel like you could touch and figure out that's a blueprint. I think that touch reading is one of those things that, as like printers and paper and things are different now than they used to be, I just think it could be a little bit harder now to touch read as opposed to in the 60s from a typewriter, you know?
Yeah, it should be. And Mark Waid has mentioned this too, that technology doesn't, work in Matt's favor in that sense, and that's true. Yeah, and also, of course, our sense of touch doesn't prefer the swirly patterns of like type. It actually, Braille is a very perfect medium for reading by touch because it really kind of plugs into how our sense of touch works. So that's another thing to consider.
And in Defenders, when they find the blueprints, he relies on Jessica's sight to explain to him exactly what the blueprints are saying.
Also true. Perfect.
So Matt and Elektra, and which one? The coming to the
Roxxon.
Party. Oh, yeah. When they walk in and they both look sexy. And he says, you look really good tonight. And because they're raising heartbeats. I just love that scene because it makes sense. And then with his other senses, you know that he can tell that she's attractive, the way she carries herself, the way she speaks, the way she smells. Yeah. I mean, we could go on like a whole episode of how he can, know that women are attractive. And
because it's actually been like, there's actually research to show that even voices are actually correlate with physical attractiveness. Yeah. So it's sort of, I like that they're pointing out that it's indirect. So that's
Definitely.
Cool. And then we have the Silent Ninjas in season 2. And actually, this goes back to what we mentioned early on about how it's important for a character to be rule governed. Because the problem that in season 2, they're talking about how Matt can't detect the ninjas because they are, I guess, hiding or like they're stopping their heartbeats or something. I don't actually remember
lowering
all the
their
details.
body temperature.
Yeah. Again, and of course, we already told you the body temperature. It's crap. But even with the heartbeats and everything, that's ridiculous though, because the fact that Matt cannot detect them if they're not making any sound would make it impossible for him to detect any silent object, including like a bookshelf. So that kind of undercuts how his senses work, which is why you need to have rules for this to begin with, because it makes everything much more easy for everyone. Yeah. We talked about that. Oh, yeah. Matt stitches up Elektra. What did you want to do with this one, Shelby?
I just want to know if you think that's like good, bad. I just want to know your I thought it was hot, but I just want to know.
I was surprised that they did that because I'm thinking it's not like he should rely more on touch to do that kind of thing, and I'm not sure it's good to have like your fingers all up in somebody's wound.
True.
That's like an open cut that needs stitching. That was weird to me. That was really weird to me.
It gets points on like a really like sexy scene, but not points in like the reality, like realistic in that world.
Yeah,
that's my thought.
Yeah, I just thought it was odd. And then we had, Matt losing his hearing and getting his powers back in season 3 and hearing feeling in the subway. I thought it was, as a scene, it was kind of like a nice dramatic scene, but it's kind of strange to me how so he only then discovers like he can feel the subway. Shouldn't he be aware of that from like earlier encounters with the subway?
They treat it like that is somehow tied to the touch. Like, I don't know, the vibrations. It was like
all of his senses were muted. That's kind of how it feels like they were communicating that.
And that, but then later on, he feels things with his feet and stuff, which of course, again, it's not crazy, but it would be kind of crazy to be like, you can, instead of using your hearing to build up like this, echolocation ability. You can use touch vibrations instead, which is sort of like, they're both sources of mechanical energy in the sense that like that's a shake and that's a vibration, and then if the vibrates air, that's a sound. It was like I'm not sure what they were going for there. It doesn't necessarily bother me all that much because I can't really tell if I should be bothered or not.
Yeah.
I was bothered by the blood that he just spit out and never cleaned up.
That's an intense scene. It's an intense scene in general.
It is. I do overall though loved how they depicted him losing his senses. I don't know if they really like do that in the comics. I mean, I think Wade does it, where he kind of like loses all perception of things. But do we really ever spend time with Matt having actually lost like his super senses? Like I found that extremely compelling in the show.
Yeah, we don't spend much time, like you rarely spend much time with him doing that. And I think that's maybe one of the shortcomings of this genre or this, this medium in general, is that you only have a very limited number of pages. And I guess that, again, that's what fanfic is for. So you can spend like 5 pages on Matt hanging out in his apartment. Because it does tend to get a little rushed, and we don't. And I think that's one of the great things with the show, too, is that you get at least to spend a lot more time just hanging out with these characters. And I think also, like, just kind of to cap this off, this episode, also say that in general, I was quite happy with the show. And I did think that overall they stayed relatively grounded. And I'm very happy that they maybe, I was actually expecting them to do away with the print reading, and they did, because that also is something that it for modern audiences that might actually just come across as silly. And so that was one thing. But I think in general, I think they kept it like more grounded than most runs of the comic. I would say almost all runs of the comic, and I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah, I thought it was really grounded. And quick shout out to all the accessibility things that they put in the show. That's another conversation for another time, or one we've already had. I don't know. But I really appreciated the show on that as well.
Yeah, so I think we're going to have to round it off here. But of course, like, leave any comments if you have any questions, if you want to ask me or the others about we have our opinions on various things from the show or the comics. Go right ahead, and we'll maybe try to tackle them. And thanks for listening, and we all hope you enjoyed this episode.
Yeah.
And of course, keep up with us at all the, we are Renew Daredevil on Twitter. We are Save Daredevil pretty much everywhere else. We have a website. We have a YouTube channel where you can also watch like mini-sodes where we talk about sort of current events from time to time and things that pop up, and gossip and stuff. I guess that's it. Over and out. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thank you for listening to Talk Daredevil, the official podcast of the Save Daredevil campaign. For more information on Save Daredevil, please visit our website at savedaredevil.com. Remember, Murdochs always get